Hey everyone, you're tuning into the Drake Martinez podcast. I'm your host. So today is a new episode. It's been a few months since I've been able to publish a new episode because I've been a little preoccupied with work, and my wife is due actually pretty much any day now to deliver our, go into labor for our baby. And we have another podcast called Engaging Walk where we talk a lot about marriage. And that's all those things have sort of taken a priority, but I've had some nice career changes recently that's going to free up a lot of my time. And I'm really happy about that. Spend more time at home, and you guys can expect a lot more content, a lot more weekly, and 2-3 episodes a week coming up into from here on out. So I'm really looking forward to that. And I think I've seen a lot of positive reactions to the political content, so I think I'm going to stay with that. I'm trying to make it as positive as possible, even though there's a lot of really crazy things going on in the world, and give a different perspective that you might be hearing from a lot of traditional conservative opinions, and a lot of historical context I'm going to try to give you guys. So without further ado, I'm going to dive into today's content, which is going to be about the Trump movement. And I might have talked a little bit about this in previous episodes, but it's been a long time since a president has sought to hold office for non-consecutive terms. The last president, I'm pretty sure the only president that's ever done it, is Grover Cleveland. So it'd be quite a feat if Trump was able to do it again. Right now, he is polling very, very well, which is not surprising, considering that if you just look, from an unbiased perspective, if you just look at the way that President Biden's polls have been going, he has not really had successful polling in a broad range of areas and then across demographics. He's had a really high disapproval rating, and all of that bodes to a re-election of President Trump going into this 2024 election. However, there's a lot of time between now and November. Things can shake up considerably. A lot of things can change. And I think one of the major things that works in Trump's favor is how unpopular and unfavorable Vice President Kamala Harris is. So, I'm not going to give too much of my opinion on that. I'm just going to give you guys the facts, and you guys can take them for what they are. But I think sometimes people don't take the Trump movement into consideration when they're in terms of the historical context of how this man came to ride this wave, because he indeed rode a wave. It wasn't like he just came out of a vacuum. He didn't just pop out of nowhere and just be like, hey, I'm here. He kind of did, but he kind of didn't. If you know a little bit about what happened, in terms of American politics between 2008 and 2012, and then from 2012 going into 2016, and a little bit prior to that, especially during the younger years of Bush, of Bush 43, George W. Bush, that is, he had a really tumultuous presidency. So let's go into that. So pretty much since the 1970s, even going into the 1960s, but this has really been a trend since the 1970s, is America has gone from Republican to Democrat, Republican to Democrat, Republican to Democrat. And there have been a few exceptions to this rule. One would be when you go from Franklin Delano Roosevelt to Harry Truman, but that was because Franklin Delano Roosevelt died while he was in office. But ever since then, you've had America has pretty steadily gone from Republican to Democrat, flip-flopping. And another exception to this would be Reagan going into George H.W. Bush, Bush 41, Bush the Elder, who recently passed away, or not so recently, but in re- relatively recently he passed away, and I think this is a reflection of how popular that president was during their tenure. Some presidents gain popularity after their tenure, and some have tremendous popularity afterwards, and then also during. And Reagan was one of those. Reagan was very, very popular during his administration and popular afterwards. And his popularity in terms of like what he was able to accomplish, the fall of the Soviet Union, and then next week I'm going to do an episode entirely on the Cold War. But just for now, just understand that this notion of like going back and forth between Republican and presidents and Democratic presidents happens. It is absolutely the norm, especially for the last 50 years or so. The only exceptions that I can think of right now off the top of my head is Truman after Roosevelt's tenure, partially because of the death of FDR during his presidency, and there's a lot of like really interesting things that happened during that time in which Wallace, his previous vice president, was removed, and then Truman came in, but that's a different discussion for a different day. And then you have George H.W. Bush coming in after Ronald Reagan. And a lot of that also had to do with the fact that H.W. Bush was Ronald Reagan's vice president. Now, this almost occurred again in the next presidency, which was Bill Clinton. And afterwards, Bill Clinton, his vice president, Al Gore, was almost elected in the 2000 election. And the 2000 election is something that I think is really interesting if you look back on it. If we take a look back on it, because of how critical those months were with the recount that happened recount of what happened in Florida. Also another topic for a different day. We're not going to go too in depth into that. We're going to stay focused on this notion of the Trump wave and the Trump movement and how Trump rode the wave. It wasn't really something that he built. It was something that he saw, took advantage of, and then rode. For better or for worse. However you want to depict the man, however you want to think about him, that's not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about today is just purely how the movement came to be from historical analysis and a historical point of view. Okay, so we've established this fact that Republicans and Democratic presidents flip-flop pretty much every term, or whether it be for 4-year term or 8-year, 2 4-year terms. It goes back and forth with a couple of exceptions, and a couple of like really crazy things that happened, especially with the 2000 election with George W. Bush and then Gore. Okay, so now let's take a little, because this actually goes back to the 2000 election all the way into the 2008 election. Now, immediately after Bush was president, there was a lot of media attacking George W. Bush. Now, this was kind of like unprecedented because the media favored Bill Clinton very heavily. He was a very, very popular president. Economy was doing really well. However, he does get impeached. But the sentiment that people had of Bill Clinton during that time was that he was a good president. They didn't really. A lot of people might have thought like, I don't really agree with like democratic principles, but there wasn't really a lot of crazy polarization during the 90s. And Republicans and Democrats could work together, especially with Newt Gingrich as the Speaker of the House. There was a lot of bipartisan effort, and a lot of people really did not look at Bill Clinton as unfavorable, even going into the impeachment. The impeachment, I remember, obviously I was a young boy during that time, but the impeachment, I think, caught a lot of Americans by surprise. They were like, oh, wow, Bill Clinton got impeached. But the Monica Lewinsky thing, the Monica Lewinsky scandal was a real scandal. Like that permeated and pushed through, and that was what a lot of people were talking about during the time. I remember. Again, I was born, in the late 80s, but I have, very vivid memories of that time. I remember him, going on TV and playing the saxophone. He was a cool, hip, younger president that people, generally speaking, really liked. They didn't really have negative opinions about him. Obviously, if you get into things like what people were saying about him, like on talk radio, which was really popular during that time, there was he had his enemies. Obviously, also within the Republican Congress, he had his enemies. But again, largely speaking, Americans didn't have these divided lines of I'm a Republican, I'm a conservative, and then I'm a liberal, I'm a Democrat, and then the two just like wouldn't mix. Politics at that time was very, how do I put it? There wasn't any animosity, or if there was, it was very well hidden. It wasn't public. It wasn't in your face. It wasn't everywhere you go. It wasn't on every news channel. It wasn't, the people were able to accept the fact that some people thought very differently and some people thought a little bit differently, and that wasn't grounds in order to like not be friends or to have discussions and find some like common ground. Like people would have, I remember, within my family and going to like family events, that people would have different political opinions about things that were happening during the time, but they could have like civil discussions about it, and they would like, oh yeah, well that's Uncle Bob. He's a Democrat, but we still love him. And I remember specifically, my dad loved talking to my uncle like about politics, and they had very, very different opinions, but they were best friends. They were connected via, through marriage, but once they got talking about politics, like it didn't really bother them. They were just like, oh, I disagree about that. You're crazy, And then they'd be like, all right, well, let's go. We want to go play some basketball, or what kind of game's on today? That was normal back then. It wasn't so entrenched. It wasn't trench warfare like it is today. Okay, so we've established the 90s. Now we're going into the 2000 election. Immediately after Bush was elected and he became the president, but Bush 43, there was this immediate sentiment amongst people in the country that Bush might have stolen the election, and he stole it from Gore, that he lost a popular vote, that he was an illegitimate president. And this was the first time that I had ever heard things like that. I never heard people talk about, Bill Clinton as illegitimate or that he was dumb. People in the media, and I remember like this was the first time that I had teachers commenting about politics in school, and like, yeah, this guy's dumb. He stole the election. This whole thing is crazy. And then also this was around the time of like the Y2K scare. There's a lot of people scared about Y2K, and this was like the first time in which you had this like media frenzy that was like coming about and like painting the president in a negative light. Then 9/11 happened, and the media, the country, all rallied together behind George W. Bush. I'm pretty sure if you look back on his approval rating immediately after September 11th, this might have been the only time in American history where like a president's approval rating was like in the 90s, I think it was. And it wasn't so much that people liked George Bush at that time. It was just more of the fact that America was attacked. This guy spoke very clearly and decisively about who was going to pay, how they were going to pay, and that they were going to pay decisively. And I think people just resonated with that type of leadership at that time. Things changed wildly after the Iraq War, and it must have been, I think, March 2003. I will never forget. The sentiment of the country just changed so rapidly. People did not understand why we were getting involved in Iraq. People did not like the war. People did not like George W. Bush. And then he went back to being as like painted as a moron, being painted as incompetent, a liar, a cheat. Again, going back to what that narrative was going in after the election. It wasn't like it just sprouted after the Iraq war. It had, granted, it wasn't as like potent as it was after the election in 2000, but it was just so much stronger. And again, this is like the first time in my life that teachers, again, were commenting on politics in the classroom. It didn't happen before. It really did not. Now, going into the 2004 election, some background is I'm from Boston, and Boston is a very liberal, very, very liberal area. And after the 2004 election, when Bush beat Kerry's from that area. So obviously there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be very favorable of, think very favorably of John Kerry. But I remember at that time, my teachers were showing us like headlines about like the whole world thinks that America's gone crazy by reelecting this crazy and, this crazy moron in George W. Bush. Now, I wasn't really involved in politics. I didn't really have much of an opinion, but I'm just stating the facts as I remember them. I'm stating like the sentiment of the country, the sentiment of the media at large. Obviously on Fox News, I remember like Bill O'Reilly, Sean Hannity, like people like that were very defensive of the president, defensive of his policies, and were able to to articulate counter viewpoints that weren't so popular around like the media at large. But that being said, this was a time in which the country in general was not very favorable of in terms of like public opinion, in terms of like how like the media would look at this person and portray him. They did not portray George W. Bush in a very positive light at all. And then this just only got worse going into the recession in 2008 and the bailouts. Like people just were not happy. People at that time were ready for a change. So many years of war, terrorism, global terrorism, the Patriot Act, Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, and then you have this huge financial meltdown that happened. And man, it'd be really interesting to look back, on like headlines. But I remember there just being like a epidemic of, very sadly, that people were committing suicide during that time. Financial professionals, people that lost like all their savings. It was a really, really crazy time. And all of this led up to the 2008 election between John McCain on one side with his vice president, his VP, which was going to be Sarah Palin. And then on the other side, you had this young, charismatic, black man from Chicago, and his vice president, Joe Biden. Of course, I'm talking about Barack Obama. And again, during this time, I'm not very political. I don't really have much of political understanding, a very basic one at that. I just had more civic understanding of how the country was supposed to run. The three branches of government, the Constitution. I was actually pretty well informed about how all those things worked, even back then as a young man at this point, in my early 20s. But the country was ready for a change like at no other time. And for the first time, the country or at least during my lifetime, and then in recent times, probably going all the way, the last time that this kind of like fervor happened was like during the Vietnam War, this like desire for change. And this occurred, I think, Obama, I think, was just like lightning in a bottle. It would never have repeated again if it were not for Trump. But Barack Obama was able to like take this, ride this wave, capture this sentiment, and like I remember the night that he got elected, like people were crying. People were like, "Oh my God, like we did it. He's elected. It's amazing. Everything's going to be different." And boy, were they correct. But I think not in the way that a lot of people anticipated. Now again, from 2000, everyone can just like agree, I think, reasonably, that from 2008 until 2016, the media adored Barack Obama. The media at large. Obviously, there's going to be dissenting opinions on like Fox News and very heavy conservative outlets, but the media at large. Right? And then we're also talking about culture. And we're talking about like entertainment. Everyone looked at this man as very close to like a saintly kind of like godly figure. And I immediately recognized like that was a recipe for disaster. That although I didn't like the heavy criticism and like the insults that were hurled at George W. Bush, I realized that it's not the media's job to just like pad this man and to, work as like his like PR piece. Like that's not what the media is there for. The media is there to give you the facts. You make your own opinion. But all of that got wiped away when Obama came into office. And for the first 4 years, there wasn't really like a whole lot of really crazy things that happened other than like Obamacare and, a couple of things here and there that I get, looking back on it in history, you're able to see like, okay, well, there was sort of like a movement of people being like, hey, you know what? I'm not really so sure about this guy. I'm so willing to give him a chance, but there's some things that he's done that like I don't really totally agree with. But from 2008 to 2016, I think that people saw the real agenda of him and really saw like, hey, you know what? This guy's actually like really, really bad for the country. And then this is the fundamental roots of the Trump movement. Now, again, recap a little bit. Take this all into consideration. During the Bush administration, there was so much desire for change. Republicans had mismanaged these wars. There's no question about that. And people were sour on the Republicans at large. I just remember that as like there's been like an overall sentiment throughout the country that people were like, you know what, they were not sold on the Republicans anymore. Whatever fondness that people had of the Reagan era, that was, now I think it's dead. That sort of like wave of like, traditional conservatism. Now we take that discontent, that dissatisfaction of the wars. The war, a lot of people were like, hey, these are war crimes. The rendition, the surveillance, the Patriot Act, there's the global like fervor of this like war on terrorism. All of that came to a boiling point in 2008, especially after the market crash, especially after the bailouts. People were like, we're done with this. But Barack Obama basically just like kept the same program, but with a smiley face on it, with the backing of the media. And I think that's when a lot of people were like, hey, you know what? I think actually, and then this was totally epitomized with Jesse Ventura and his book, Republicans and Democrats, I think it was. Democrats and Republicans. About this, a lot of people were waking up to this idea that, hey, you know what? Maybe the Republicans and the Democrats work together behind closed doors and they work for their benefit, for their political benefit, for cementing power, for cementing the bureaucratic state, for cementing the surveillance. And it's going in a direction that we never intended it to go as citizens and as taxpayers. This sort of movement, this idea of a lot of people call like a populist movement. On one side, you had the Bernie Sanders type of populist movement. On the other side, you had Trump, that the government's no longer working for us. Very reminiscent of this idea of the ideas that were coming up during the American Revolution, with the British, that although people weren't saying things like taxation without representation, but what they were saying is that this government's not working for us. It's working for a different type of interest. It's working for different goals in mind that aren't for the public good, that aren't for the American people. You mix this with the things that were happening, and this all just sort of became exacerbated by Obama's rhetoric. And again, I'm just speaking from historical facts. I'm not talking about a personal opinion. I'm talking about historical facts of how people viewed it at the time. People were viewing his rhetoric at the time, especially that there's no two words that were ever uttered during this time that created such strong divide between Americans, left and right, conservative and liberal, as the two words bitter clingers. The moment Barack Obama said the words bitter clingers, it was pretty much the trenches had been established. And if I could find the quote, let me try to see if I can find it right now. But the quote that he said, and I might be paraphrasing, is those bitter clingers. Let me see if I can find it. It's very, very crucial to understand. It's very crucial to understand because that was the moment. So I'm going to read an article from Politico, and this article is from April 11th, 2008, and it's by Ben Smith, and the headline is Obama on Small Town Pennsylvania, clinging to religion, guns, xenophobia. Huffington Post's Mayhill Fowler, this is from Ben Smith, from Politico, article from 2008, has more. So it says Huffington Post Mayhill Fowler has more from Obama's remarks at a San Francisco fundraiser Sunday, and they include an attempt to explain the resentment in small-town Pennsylvania that won't be appreciated by some of the people whose votes Obama is seeking. Quote, you go into these small towns in Pennsylvania, and a lot of small towns in the Midwest. The jobs have been gone now for 25 years, and nothing has replaced them. And they fell through the Clinton administration and the Bush administration, and each successive administration has said that somehow these communities are going to regenerate, and they have not. And it's not surprising, then, they get bitter. They cling to guns or religion or antipathy towards people who aren't like them, or anti-immigrant sentiment or anti-trade sentiment as a way to express their frustrations. So he's not saying that that these people are wrong, but he's saying that he doesn't really blame them, that the things that have happened to them are understandable, that they have been left behind. Now keep in mind that those remarks were made in 2008. And what did Barack Obama subsequently do from 2008 to 2012? And of course, there was the open borders. And there was many cases just like this happening today of illegal aliens killing American citizens who shouldn't have been in the United States. There was all this talk about DACA and the Dreamers Act, and all these avenues in which Obama was, really trying to push through illegal immigration and, creating a pathway for citizenship for people that entered the country illegally. Now, of course, there's some sympathy for people that have been here their entire lives, but, again, we're a nation of laws, and not getting into that too much today, but the fact that he called these people that they're bitter, they're clinging to their guns, xenophobia, and religion, he's not just saying that like, oh, these people are he's basically saying like these people are misguided, that they're not enlightened, that they don't think like you and I do, that they're not as sophisticated, is essentially what he's saying. Again, he says he kind of like softens it a little bit with this idea that like, oh, well, I don't really blame them for how they think, but, and there goes that like proverbial but, they still are misguided in the sense of like what they hold on to. Now, think about the things that he points to. One is religion. He's not talking about Muslims. He's not talking about Hindus. He's not talking about anybody else except for Christians there. Right? He's not talking about black people. He's not talking about Hispanics. He's talking about whites. I mean, who else would be occupying these small rural towns throughout the Midwest? It's white Christians, right? So you can see in 2008, a mere 8 years after Bush took office, a mere 9 years after Clinton was in office, and this type of rhetoric, this type of language, this type of divisive rhetoric was not used at all during those previous 9 years. This was the first time, and people did not like it. And it created, I'm telling you right now, it created a rift between conservatives and conservatives and liberals. And the rift just kept getting wider and wider and wider. After he got reelected, that rift just kept growing with every little thing that he ever did. And it was like the BLM riots. It was like all of the anti-police rhetoric, the open borders. It was the trade agreements. I mean, he just talks about it right there. People were like, hey, you know what? This country is going in a direction that I do not agree with. And then this guy, then every single time that there was a shooting. And also on a little side note, isn't it kind of odd that the shootings have like gone away? That there's no more like massive terrorism in Europe and the United States. I mean, like there was like the Pulse nightclub shooting. The only one that ever, I think the major one that happened during Trump's administration was like the Las Vegas shooting, but they never even found like a motive for that one, or at least it wasn't one that was, noted publicly. But in any event, every time that there was a shooting, every time that there was something going wrong, Obama would blame it on the guns. But what is he actually blaming? He's not blaming it on the guns. He's actually blaming it on the Constitution. He's blaming it on the Second Amendment. He's saying like these people cling to guns, religion, the Second Amendment, religion, Christianity, and xenophobia, culture. That these people cling to their culture. They cling to Americana, Americanism, American exceptionalism, the idea that we're a nation of laws, the idea that the Constitution should be held in esteem. All of these things is what he was attacking and saying that they were misguided in holding those things as in some type of reverence, right? That is what caused the rift. That right there is what caused the rift that we are still dealing with today. Those words uttered by that man during that time. I mean, that was, 16 years ago. Or more at this point, right? Like, I don't know, actually almost, we're getting pretty close to 16 years ago. Which, we have never recovered from that. As Obama's administration went on, getting closer and closer to the end, I mean, the sentiment of that burning desire for change just kept getting stronger and stronger. It was still lingering from 2008. It was still lingering from the Bush administration, because there's a lot of people on the right, there's a lot of people that were conservative that were just not happy with the Bush administration. They're not happy about the mismanagement of the war. They're not happy about the Iraq war. Not happy about the collapse of the economy. Again, not happy about the bailouts. Obama came in and people were like, okay, well, we'll give this guy a chance. And 2008 on, the trench lines just became so entrenched. And then, people were just noticing like, oh, anytime that there's like a Muslim that was shooting up people, then it was Islamophobia to blame. But anytime that there was like a white person that was involved in the shooting, then like we had to get rid of the Second Amendment and white Christian nationalism. And again, just ugly rhetoric that was just like a total onslaught. And then obviously this came to a boiling point, I think, when the Tea Party became involved. Now, at that point, I think that this is a really important part to remember, is that the Tea Party came to be because at that point in time, we're talking 2012, 2013, people were like, we're done with the Republican Party. We want to start our own party. We want to start the Tea Party. And this was the Trump movement. 36 minutes in, the Trump movement began with the Tea Party. And what happened to the Tea Party? The Tea Party was politically assassinated by the president. He utilized the IRS, who was the lowest learner, right? I think it was lowest learner, to target his political rivals. I mean, does any of this sound familiar? This is all the stuff that we're talking about today. But it all began during that time. And he used the IRS to attack the Tea Party, because that was the actual threat, right? Let's just be real about it. The Republican Party then, and even a little bit now, was not the threat to that specific agenda of, let's call it what it is, globalism. It wasn't until that time that there was a defining, let's call it a philosophy, an ideology. And a lot of people that brought about this ideological movement was, again, talk radio. Rush Limbaugh, Michael Savage, Sean Hannity, to some degree, but not as much, nowhere near as much as it was for like Rush Limbaugh, especially Michael Savage. And then it all came to a head with Alex Jones. Alex Jones and InfoWars was hugely popular hugely and massively popular at the time. And people started hopping on this idea and getting involved with it and realizing like, hey, you know what? We need to take the government back. That the government is serving a different interest. It's serving the interest of this globalism, this global elite, corporatism, fascism, all of these things that just ugly stuff became the central focal point of like where the government was actually moving and what it was highlighting. Open borders, just the movement towards unifying like a North American Union, the European Union, all these things coming to a point. And then when the Tea Party came to be, it got shut down. And then what was the response? The Tea Party took over the Republican Party. They said, you know what? Well, if they're not going to recognize the Tea Party, or if this is what's going to happen, they were just like, we're just going to take over the opposition. We're going to take over the fake opposition in the Republican Party. And that's where I think a lot of people talk about that today, where, in so many areas, like the Republican Party is, it's not really like opposition. It's controlled. That's the phrase that so many people use for the Republican Party, and it's very fitting for it. It's controlled opposition. It will allow opposition in areas, and it's just so disorganized and so inept at best, in order to be able to combat against the ideas that it says that it combat against. This is where all that started to take place. And to be clear, the complete takeover of the Republican Party is still in progress from that Tea Party movement. And that is what Donald Trump represents. He represents that era of populism, of, again, that ideology of, and the great way to really understand this is the groundwork of establishing this political philosophy is, I think, should be accredited to Michael Savage. If you read his book, Borders, Language, and Culture, you will really understand what the movement is all about. You have to, and it's probably the most crucial book that you could ever read in order to really understand the Trump movement is Borders, Language, and Culture, because it's not really like a far right idea. It's actually a very moderate idea. It's just taking control over the national identity of the United States by controlling how little or how much the borders, language, and culture of the United States is going to be changed. Defending the border, defending our culture, and defending our language. And if you look at a lot of the ways in which the hardcore extreme leftists attack the United States, it's the border, our language, by controlling what we say, controlling the words that we can use, and our culture by permitting so many different deviant behaviors and deviant ways of looking at things and ideologies, and bringing them into the mainstream. And you hear this word that they use a lot. Let's normalize X, Y, and Z. Let's normalize this. Let's normalize that. I'm sure that you guys can fill in the blanks and figure out exactly what I'm talking about here. But that is the language that they use to normalize the deviant behavior that they've brought into the mainstream. Now, I'm not saying that these people are evil. What I'm saying is that the behavior is deviant. It's abnormal. It's not normal behavior. It's fringe behavior that has been brought into the norm. There's a lot of fringe behavior out there, and a lot of it doesn't get any recognition at all. You only have to look on the internet to find people doing just really, really odd things, or things that are just not normal, that your everyday person's not doing publicly and won't announce it publicly. But the goal of changing the culture is to bring those things into the mainstream. And then, as they say, normalize it. Let's normalize this. Let's normalize that. Making those things normal changes the Overton window. Okay, so now we're on Trump. Trump rode this wave, and he recognized very astutely. And if you go back to the 2016 Republican, the debates, when you had all those people on there, Marco Rubio, Jeb Bush, Rand Paul, again, the main people that you have to accredit for the Trump movement, and I forgot a major person, was Ron Paul. Ron Paul was instrumental in that, because the way that he just tore down debates with just we should totally disband the CIA. It's unconstitutional. All this stuff. It was coming to a head. Trump is the one that gave it wings. Trump was the one that gave it a figurehead. Again, the political ideologies, the political structure of it came from people like Michael Savage, Ron Paul, even people like Alex Jones, actually, and Rush Limbaugh. There's this whole movement that was boiling over and coming to a head, and Trump was like, you know what? Those are the people that have a voice that resonates with a lot of people, not just on the right, but on the left too, and independents. And he captivated it. He took it, and he used that. I mean, he had just, I don't want to recap the 2016 election, but the 2016 election was just him giving those ideas and that political ideology a microphone and a speaker. and a figurehead. And then when he came through with that and rode that wave, people were like, I'm going to latch onto that. Now, you had a lot of independents, and you had a lot of Democrats, actually, and a lot of people on the far right, but you also had a lot of people who are more like Ron Paul, Rand Paul, libertarian type of people who were like, you know what? This is the guy. This is the guy that is bringing the fight to the opposing ideology. This is not controlled opposition. This is what real opposition looks like. Compare the way that the media treated, Jeb Bush with the way that they treated Donald Trump. And if you go back to this to the 2016, the earlier debates, Trump was the only one up there that was like, we need to limit immigration. We need to limit what's going on at the border. And then you had people like Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush calling him racist, coming from the Republican Party. And that just broke the mold. People were like, no, dude, we don't want the border open. We don't want people coming in illegally. And we do want to limit immigration. There's just there's too much of it going on. It's out of control. We don't really know very well who's coming into the country. But again, where did that stem from? That stemmed from that 2008 comment from Barack Obama, the xenophobia comment. They cling to it. They cling to the Bible. Well, he said religion. He didn't say Bible, to be fair to him. But he meant the Bible, to be clear, because of the demographics of the people that he was talking about. They cling to their religion. They cling to their guns, and they cling to their xenophobia. And of course, again, all of this came to a head with Trump. So I hope, wrap it up here. We're getting closer to 50 minutes. But I hope this gives some historical context. I hope this gives some background to how Trump came in and why that movement is so important. It's, to just summarize it real quick, it was a juxtaposition to so many years of turmoil, so many years of broken promises, so many years of just hardship and alienation from the majority of Americans or a median of Americans who felt like the government was just leaving them behind. And the government was using different voices and using those opinions to benefit a small, very elite group of people and leaving the rest of the United States behind. And it wasn't until the Tea Party came to be, was shut down, and then integrated itself into the Republican Party that finally there was room to take that movement and make it something new. And when it finally had a figurehead that was willing to fight in Donald Trump, that movement that he rode, that he recognized and led, turned into something new and something very different. And Obama had this almost cult of personality on his own. Trump didn't really have that on his own. He rode the wave, and then captured that lightning in a bottle in a very different manner that, is really interesting to take a look at in its historical context. So hopefully you guys like the content from today. Next week's episodes are going to be much, much shorter than today's, but this is something that I was really thinking a lot about. I've been thinking a lot about lately, so I wanted to share it with you guys. All right, thank you guys for tuning in. Expect some new episodes next week. Definitely going to talk about the Cold War. And then if you have any other topics you think that should be addressed, let me know in the comments. All right, thank you guys for tuning in. This is Drake with the Drake Martinez Podcast. You can always find more on my YouTube channel where I talk a lot about music. I don't really get into politics on the on my videos, mostly music. And so I think in the future it'll be a lot of mixture of politics, history, current events, philosophy, and that way it's a little bit different from what you might hear anywhere else. All right, with that, I'm going to be signing out, and I'll see you guys next week. Thank you.